Thank you. Now, who is going first? Is it you, Mr. Skelton?
Mr. Chambers, I ask questions on behalf of one of the family groups. Can I just understand your evidence from earlier about your status in relation to risk? I think you said you were the accountable officer, is that correct?
That is correct, yes.
What does that mean in practice?
In practice, it's a technical thing for all chief executives. It's, as the accountable officer, you are responsible statutorily for the financials and delivering on the financial, the financial governance, but also the internal governance, which includes risk.
Includes operational risk?
It includes all risk, yes.
All risk. At the start of your evidence today, Mr. Delapour asked you in detail about the information that was given to you in late June, early July about the consultant's concerns about Lucy Letby?
Yes.
It was clear from that evidence and the documents surrounding it that their concern was that she might have been responsible for the increase in neonatal death?
I think what they were saying was that there had been an unexplained increase in mortality, and that there had been a member of staff on duty more times than another member of staff, and then there was nothing really more concrete than that.
Well, wasn't there? There were stable children who deteriorated without medical explanation, and unexpectedly, who failed to respond as appropriately to resuscitation, and they had even started to speculate, and you were aware of this, that they might have been murdered.
So at the time, there was certainly nobody talking about criminality. There was certainly lots of examples that things were happening in an unexpected and unexplained way. But there was nobody really pointing to say this was deliberate. There were, and I asked the question many times at many meetings, are we saying this is deliberate harm? Are we saying this is criminality? Or are we saying, or versions of that? And there was many thoughts and different opinions that were being raised, but there was nothing that you could really put your thumb on.
You were aware it was a possibility?
I was aware of possibility, so I was listening to the doctor's concerns, and I was also listening to my own gut feelings, which were, I was aware from visiting the unit myself in December 2015 and other times, that this was a unit that was running hot, that this was a unit that had seen an increase in demand. This was a unit that the acuity had gone up. This was a unit where the birth rates had gone down, so there was more than simply, there was more going on than we could explain.
You were aware of the possibility that the babies had been deliberately killed, yes?
I was aware only of the concerns that were raised, and the circumstantial link with an individual member of staff.
Well, the evidence you have already given, and the evidence given by Miss Kelly and many others, was that after the two triplets died, the consultants were concerned that they had been killed by Lucy Letby, and they wanted her off the unit. The possibility that she had done so deliberately was a valid one, wasn't it? You were aware of that.
So can you show me the INQ reference of that?
No, it's a vast amount of evidence that has been given over the last 2...
But you are speaking very emphatically there, and that is not what I remember.
You don't remember being told by Alison Kelly that the consultants wanted Lucy Letby off the unit?
Oh, I remember Alison telling me the things I had outlined, that there had been an increase in unexplained mortality, that there were concerns about the association with a member of staff, and maybe there was concerns raised that this member of staff needed to be removed. So,
just to be clear, is it your evidence that you were not aware of the possibility that children may have been deliberately harmed at the end of June and the beginning of July 2016?
It was much less explicit than that. If for one moment that's what I believed I had heard, and that was what was being said, the board would have gone straight to the police.
When did you become aware of that possibility?
I think as we did more investigations, as I have said previously, and we took the guidance from independent experts, and the guidance that they were telling us seemed to be pointing away from deliberate harm.
I am not asking you that question. I'm sorry, you are going to have to really focus on answering my question. When were you aware of the possibility?
So I am saying to you, it was something that was never concretely said in the way that you have said. I mean, I think there is so much hindsight inherent within your question. At the time, that's not the information that I had, or we had.
Miss Kelly was clearly aware of that possibility. She talked about it in her evidence this week, and she talked about safeguarding. Mr. Harvey was also aware of it. He discussed it with the Royal College on the first day of their visit. Are you aware of that?
Yes, but what they weren't saying, that this was an individual who was deliberately harming babies. This was somebody who there was a circumstantial link and gut feeling. Nothing more than that.
Sorry, that's the possibility of harm was aware. They were aware of that at that time?
Oh, okay. If you are, I think it's when you use the emotive language of murder that it becomes, not something that I heard at that time. If you are saying the possibility of harm, then, there was discussions. Was this a competence issue? Was this what was the range of scenarios and issues that we would need to explore?
When were you aware of that possibility?
Oh, I think I felt those issues almost immediately, really.
All right. Well, that's taken about 10 minutes to get to. Can I ask you this? What is the risk that the consultants were right? What was the risk?
Say again, sorry.
What was the risk in your mind that the consultants were right?
Then, if we didn't take action, if I didn't remove Letby, then this deliberate harm might well continue.
Indeed. So risk is usually seen in two ways, or with two factors. There is a likelihood and there is consequence. What was the likelihood that they were right?
Based on what we knew at the time, and based on what the conversations that we had had in various meetings, where I had said quite deliberately, are we suggesting that this is deliberate harm? And the answer was, we don't know. It's difficult to quantify that. But the fact that we couldn't quantify it in itself didn't mitigate any of the risk, so therefore Letby was removed, the unit was downgraded, and all the actions that followed.
So you had an unquantifiable risk that children might have been harmed by her, and the consequences were obvious. Death and injury, they are the consequences of not removing her, correct?
But she was removed.
Yes, but I am asking about if she had gone back. The consequences of that risk.
Right, okay, yes. By that time, so I thought we were talking about 2016, in terms of 2017, you are right, but at that time, it was genuinely felt by the board and myself, and the advice that we were getting, that it was pointing away from deliberate harm.
Did you ever register the risk formally in any of the management processes?
I mean, that's a really fair point. I think the answer to that is no.
From a safeguarding perspective, had this been looked at through the lens of safeguarding, it required an immediate response. That risk, and the reason it requires an immediate response, is because the consequences are so grave and potentially unmanageable. You recognize that? 24 hours local safeguarding officer and the police. That is the appropriate response to a risk of that sort in an ordinary setting, correct?
Correct, yes.
Other witnesses, I think Miss Kelly being one of them, have accepted that there was a safeguarding risk here, which should have triggered that response. Do you accept that, or do you disagree?
I would have taken advice around whether this was a safeguarding matter from the safeguarding lead, Alison Kelly. I would have taken advice whether this should have been a matter for a SUDIC process from our clinical leads. I was minded by the fact that if it was genuinely felt that this was deliberate harm by this individual, I am absolutely confident that the professionals, the doctors, would have alerted these processes themselves, either directly to the police, or they would have gone through one of those mechanisms where the fact that those things didn't happen in itself created a sense that risks were being managed.
But you know that consultants find it extremely difficult to whistleblow on their colleagues. They don't generally deal with these sorts of situations. They are also extremely concerned that they will find themselves in hot water with the GMC or internally with their employer. There are a lot of disincentives. Robert Francis talked about this. You are well aware of this. You have been in the NHS for years. The fact that they don't trigger a safeguarding process doesn't necessarily mean or exonerate one from triggering one if you are aware of it, does it?
I am struggling to see what the risk to them would be of triggering a safeguarding process.
Well, the risk to it could be triggered unnecessarily, and it could cause matters to rebound on them, obviously. That is what they talked about.
So, is there not a professional responsibility to do just that?
There is, and it's also on you. Do you accept it?
Yes, absolutely.
You should have triggered the safeguarding process just like everybody else.
I don't know. I am genuinely not sure, but if the guidance that I would have been getting from my safeguarding lead, I would be guided by that. We didn't view it as a safeguarding issue. I don't think anybody did. I think it was viewed as an unexplained increase in mortality, with not really any clarity as to what those causes were. You are simplifying it to one cause. I don't think that was where we viewed it.
You viewed it, in fact, as a hypothesis and not a risk. You viewed it through the prism of a hypothesis. It is possible these babies may have been killed deliberately. But you didn't see it as a risk, is that fair?
I think that might be a reasonable way of describing it. As I said before, at the end of my last evidence, that all evidence to date at that time pointed to unexplained deaths being more likely to be caused by a multifactorial set of issues rather than a single act or individual. I don't think that was... If that is a hypothesis, then I accept that.
You said in answer to questions from Mr. Delapour that your job as chief executive, or one of your jobs, is to ask the right questions.
Yes.
Did you ever ask Ian Harvey or anyone else? Have you satisfactorily excluded the possibility that Lucy Letby has deliberately harmed children?
We asked that question in a slightly different way, in that have we been able to establish anything that is... Well, the question was framed in many different ways, but one example of that, and it was a meeting on the 27th of March, I asked, are we saying that this is deliberate, that this is criminality? So we did ask that question.
That is not the same question, though, is it? The issue is, did you ask any of your staff if they had satisfactorily excluded the possibility, so directly confronted it and excluded it?
I'm not sure that we did ask that question.
Because Mr. Delapour has taken you through all the various investigations, so there is the Royal College investigation or review, that did not exclude that possibility, did it?
It gave examples of where the care could be improved, or where the leadership could be improved, or the staffing levels could be improved. But as I said in my own witness statement, it didn't answer the question.
Nor did Dr. Horden.
I think Dr. Horden's review, and maybe it's a misinterpretation, and I don't think it is, but Dr. Horden's review was that there was nothing pointing to deliberate, to unnatural causes.
That's not the same as excluding it, is it? In fact, she asked for a forensic review to take place in respect of 5 children, although it ended up being 4.
Yes.
So she did not exclude the possibility of deliberate harm, and was not indeed asked to exclude it?
I believe, and you may wish to pick this up with Mr. Harvey, but the way that the work that Dr. Horden was doing was commissioned, was deliberately constructed in a way that she would keep an open mind, and those things would hopefully be flushed through. And the outcomes of that, her work, as I said many times, didn't point to deliberate harm. The 4 cases where things were unascertained, when they were reviewed by pathologists, didn't point to deliberate harm. I'm not sure what else to make of that, other than there is no deliberate harm.
That is a false inference. So you are saying they didn't positively point to deliberate harm, but they quite explicitly did not exclude deliberate harm, did they? None of them. The Royal College didn't, because it wasn't a case note review. They never looked at the medical records of the children. Dr. Horden looked in detail at the medical notes of the children, but she explicitly said, I can't exclude unnatural causes, and she asked for forensic case note review. And Dr. McPartland, in the more limited review, couldn't exclude deliberate harm either. None of them did.
And the guidance that we were getting, that I was hearing, and the inferences that we were making, that there was nothing that was suggesting unnatural causes to the causes of death to those babies. They had had post-mortems previously and so on. So and again, as I said, 8 years on, when you look back, you can see that following the police inquiries and all the rest of it, that the causes of death have now been called into, a different explanation than the ones that we arrived at had been agreed.
But if you look at the instructions don't say, this is the suspicion, please will you investigate it and exclude it as a possibility? At no point do any of those cases that occurred.
Yes, and again, you will need to test this, but my view is that we didn't want to in any way prejudice the work that was being doing. We wanted everybody to keep an open mind, as we were. I can't say any more. I'm sorry.
In your response to the consultant's concerns in 2018, you said that you believed the trust could demonstrate that it's taken the concerns that they have very seriously, and you have been open and transparent with the coroner, with our regulators, and as far as the police investigation allows, with staff, parents and the public. Can I test that, please? First of all, NHS England. You will be aware that they have provided an opening statement to this inquiry, and Sir Stephen Powis has given a statement. The opening statement by NHS England says, to the best of NHS England's knowledge, the concerns about potential criminal conduct were not shared at this point. In other words, when they arose around June-July 2016, and this information was also not shared with NHS England. How does that square with your assertion to the consultants in 2018?
So again, it's the first thing what we thought we were doing was trying to explain the causes of increased unexplained mortality. There was a suggestion that a single member of staff was on duty more times than another. So those are the two facts of it. That in his evidence, Robert Francis talked about how difficult it can be to balance the duty of candour with the duty of care, and this was a balance that we were trying to manage. So hopefully from the recommendations from this inquiry, there can be greater clarity around how that balance can be delivered. But candour starts with an investigation, and that's what we were doing.
There is clearly expectation on part of the regulatory of that body, we will come on to the CQC in a moment, that you would have told them of a concern at that level. And for obvious reasons, if you have a nurse that's either so incompetent that she's managed to kill a lot of children, or has deliberately harmed children, and you are setting in train a series of internal and external investigations to look at that concern, that is clearly a matter of interest to NHS England, isn't it?
And in 2016, I think the information that was shared with NHS England was around the increase in the mortality.
Yes.
Not the link to the nurse. The link to the nurse, I think, was made, the NHS England were made aware of that sometime in 2017. I know that the link person that Alison was connecting with to share all of these concerns was with Margaret Kitching, and Margaret, I think, it's fair to say, was fully cited on these issues. But when she was fully cited on these issues, I am not absolutely certain.
Do you accept that NHS England should have been told about the concerns that a single nurse was responsible for the increase in deaths when those concerns arose?
The answer is, I don't know. It's just that balance between candour and duty of care. Whether we got that balance wrong, I'm not sure at that time whether we had got the balance right.
Does the same answer apply to the CQC? You will be aware that Anne Ford has given evidence in writing and orally to this inquiry. She made clear that she would have expected your hospital to have told the CQC, which it visited in February, about the increased mortality as and when it arose, and about concerns as and when.
Say that again, please.
It would have expected to have been informed about increased mortality as and when it became an issue, and it would have been, can I just finish? Would have expected to have been told about the concerns in respect of a single nurse, as and when that arose.
Okay, so, as a process arising, coming out of any serious incident review, which I think some of the babies involved in June, July 2015 were subject to, The CQC and the CCG would have been made aware of those reviews at that time. In terms of if your question is, should we have shared the thematic review with the CQC? Well, my understanding is that the thematic review hadn't been shared with us at that time, or if it had literally only just been shared with us. And by us, I mean Ian Harvey and Alison Kelly. I didn't see the thematic review until much later. It wouldn't be usual to share something that hasn't been through our own internal governance processes. And we know that sharing the thematic review through our own internal governance processes had been problematic. It hadn't gone through to the QSPEC in a timely way. It hadn't gone to the Women's and Children's Governance Board in a timely way. So it's difficult to be really clear whether that document should have been shared at that time. But it may well have been. And I think you need to test that conversation with Mr. Harvey tomorrow, because there isn't any clear record as to whether the CQC had got that report or not.
Well, the CQC through Anne Ford has given evidence that they considered the trust not to have been transparent with them about this matter.
Yes, we weren't a trust that was not transparent with the CQC. We were always a trust that, if there was risk concerns, we were one of those trusts that would alert the CQC, rather than being waited to ask. So all I can assume is that any delay in it being shared with the CQC was because there had been a delay in the thematic review being shared through our own internal processes. Subsequently, it was shared. Was it not shared in March?
So their evidence is that just if you give me 1 second, first aware of the increased mortality on the 29th of June when Alison Kelly rang.
Okay.
Made a phone call?
Yes. Okay.
So many months after the thematic review? Do you have a comment on that?
No. If that's the point of fact, I seem to remember, and I can't give you the specifics, but I do seem to remember that bundles of documents following the review were shared with the CQC, as is common practice. They take a load of documents in advance, they do their review, and then they make requests for further. It was my understanding that the thematic review, I think, was part of one of those bundles, but I can't be absolutely certain.
When it comes to the board, I won't take you in great detail through all the various meetings for obvious reasons. But there was a meeting on January 10th, 2017, where Ian Harvey presented a report that he had done?
Yes.
A very short report. That's at INQ 00033518. It's going to come up on screen. So it's a very short report. But he is basically saying there were some concerns raised by the clinical team regarding higher than usual number of neonatal deaths from January 2015, together with inconclusive results from internal reviews. He doesn't there tell the board that the actual concern was the possibility of deliberate harm, does he?
Not specifically in that paragraph, but
If you were a board member, Mr. Chambers, and you needed to be fully sighted to make a decision, you would want to know that the body of pediatricians working on your neonatal unit by this stage thought that one of their nurses had killed the children. You would need to know that in terms, wouldn't you?
So this was a board meeting in January 2017.
Yes.
The paediatricians had been at the board meeting in, I think it was July 17th, 2016, with all of the board. The notes of that meeting were very frank, open and inclusive. The concerns that the paediatricians had raised would have been cited on them.
But for these purposes, those concerns were still in existence. They were still held vehemently so by this point, and they had not gone away, but Mr. Harvey doesn't clarify them?
Well, the report is as it's written, yes.
Well, he should have told the board the concerns were still there.
I think he would have believed that was something that the board did understand from previous meetings and discussions that had gone on previously.
He mentions the Royal College review, but that had not excluded the concern, had it? As you have agreed?
No.
He also mentioned the external case review, but that had not excluded that concern either, had it?
Well, it had, There were 4 unascertained.
Well, as at this stage the concerns had not been satisfactorily excluded conclusively, had they?
Well, 13 cases had been given explanations and causes that were not deliberate harm or were not unnatural causes. 13 had also, it had been identified that there was strong evidence in all cases that there had been suboptimal care, and in some cases significant suboptimal care. There were 4 cases, out of the Jane Horden review, that required further investigation.
So, no?
I have outlined to you the position.
At this stage, the recommendation, it seems from you and Mr. Harvey, was that the nurse who was potentially responsible should come back to the unit?
Responsible for what?
For the harm?
As I keep saying there was an explanation for the causes of death. There was an explanation at that time for what was previously described as an unexplained increase in mortality. There was nothing that was talking about deliberate harm.
What was the explanation for Child A's death? Who was the first infant?
It remained unascertained, as you know.
So what did you mean when you just said there was an explanation? What was it?
What I said, in 13 cases, there was causes and explanations given. In 4 cases, and I think one of those 4 was baby A.
Yes. 5 cases, in fact?
Yes. And, to be honest, you're probably better going through this report and the detail of this with Mr. Harvey. But that was my understanding, that at the end of all of this, there were 2 cases that remained unascertained, unexplained, and there was a view that in itself is not unusual.
Whose view was that?
I think Nim Subheda maybe have, but it's something that I will need to ask you to refer to Mr. Harvey. But in previous notes that we have been through today, this was a point that Duncan made, that it was not unusual, and there will have been a source for that opinion. I'm not 100% sure what the source of that opinion was.
Mr. Chambers, it's an odd feature of your evidence today that you don't seem to fully recognize that the consultants were entirely right about the risks and what had happened, and you were entirely wrong. And so when I put to you that in 2017, those concerns that they had, and had indeed from 2015, had not been addressed satisfactorily and there was still a risk, that is correct, isn't it? She had in fact killed the children?
All I can offer you is the evidence of what we knew, what we believed, what we did at the time of 2016-2017. The fact that now, on the basis of the police inquiry that followed, led to indictments and convictions, was not the position at that time. So both positions can be correct.
Well, the position at the time was that you had a group of consultants who didn't want Lucy Letby back on the unit because they thought she had deliberately harmed their patients. And you had an executive team that wanted Lucy Letby back on the unit and were encouraging the board to allow that to happen. That is the reality.
There was a grievance process. Out of the grievance process, there was recommendations, one of which is that, subject to the completion of all of the reviews and no suggestion of any connection with deliberate harm, then Letby should be returned to the unit. The position that we took to the board was the outcome of that recommendation, based on all the things we knew in good faith, and we continued the conversations with the clinicians, as you know. But the other point of fact is, irrespective of whether we believed at that time that Letby should have gone back to the unit, as soon as new matters became known to us, as soon as new concerns, or concerns that had been known for many, many years or months were shared with us, the change that Lucy Letby was, the status quo was maintained, and the exploration of escalating to the police was explored and eventually delivered.
So could you just be absolutely clear? What was the new information which tipped the balance?
It was the concerns that Dr. Jayaram had alerted to Sue Hodkinson that led to me going to have a conversation with him. I did not go into that meeting in a very heavy-handed way saying, tell me all about. I just wanted to find a way to softly listen. That led to the meeting on the 27th of March. That led eventually to the police being called.
Sorry, what specific information did you learn?
It was, you know exactly what I am talking about. It's the
Just answer his question.
It's the concerns that Mr. Jairam, Dr. Jairam, had raised in respect to Lucy's conduct on the unit, in respect of maybe a desaturation baby that he didn't feel that she was attending to, or that some dials had been adjusted. Those were the nature.
Child K.
Yes,
In short.
baby K.
So when they put their report in, which is the report which Simon Medland encouraged them to write, they wrote down a summary of their main points. That wasn't one of their main points. They wrote down the familiar list: deaths, an increase in deaths, sudden and unexpected. Failure to respond to resuscitation, one member of staff being present, and investigations to date not identifying any other potential cause for the increased mortality. That wasn't sufficient for you, was it?
Say again, sorry.
That list wasn't sufficient for you. It hadn't been sufficient?
We never saw that list.
So, which of those bits of information? I can take you to the document. It's INQ 00036671.
The specific bit of information was the concerns he had raised about baby K with Sue Hodkinson on 15th April.
Just look at the list. I want you to tell me what was new for you, and when you learnt it. If we go to the second page, please, towards the bottom you will see a summary. If we could actually have both the second page and the third page on the screen so we can see the list of 6 points. If you run through that list, was any of that news to you in 2017, or did you know that really from then?
This best case paper, if that's what this was, that came out of the Simon Medland meeting, was not something that was ever shared with the senior management team.
Not my question. Which of those bits of information were you not aware of in 2016?
In 2017?
Or 16? 16, I said, but 17 if you want as well?
I think by 2017, and maybe even 2016, some of this I think was shared with the Royal College by the paediatricians.
Yes.
Some of this, I think, featured implicitly in various iterations of the thematic review.
Yes.
None of it was explicitly called out. So I suppose, you could argue that some, if not all of this, may well have been known.
Yes.
But it was just implicit rather than explicitly called out.
But it would certainly be improper, wouldn't it, to characterize those factors if they were known in 2016 as unsubstantiated allegations, wouldn't it?
Well, the number of neonatal deaths in the period is highly unusual. That's a fact. The number of unprecedented, unexpected and unexplained deaths and collapses is highly unusual. I would have to take guidance on, but yes, I'm assuming it is, although cause of death is uncertain. So, unsubstantiated, and you are making this in reference to which point?
So you said repeatedly to the board in 2017 that the consultants' concerns were unsubstantiated.
Well, their concerns were not clearly articulated. They were implicit, not explicit. It was very difficult to really make sense of what was being said. When consultants were pressed, they very explicitly, they quite honestly said, "We just don't know." So the unsubstantiated element to this is that, quite simply, all we really knew was that there had been an unexplained increase in neonates, which is unusual, and that there was a link to a single member of staff being on duty at more times than others, and that there was, at best, gut feeling.
You and the executives knew all of that information in 2016?
It was never presented in that way. It was always presented as a feeling rather than really strong. I'm reluctant to use the word evidence, but just it was just a gut feeling.
But you know now, Mr. Chambers, looking at that list, those are not feelings recorded there. They are facts, aren't they?
But what was presented was feelings.
No. All of those facts were presented to the executive in 2016.
They were presented as this is our gut, this is our, and in hindsight, yes, I mean, maybe gut feelings is something that is really strong, but it was never presented with the clarity that you have presented it here.
Did you ever ask them to present it?
Well, in so much as I've actually asked myself this question lots of times. Why did it take Simon Medland to come along and suggest that we write down your best points? But in truth, I thought that's what the thematic review had done.
We are now at 5:30, Mr. Skelton. I am not stopping you, but we do have to have a break for the shorthand writer.
We do. I have got a relatively short issues, but I'm obviously in her hands.
Yes, she's already done more time than we really should expect. We will take a 10-minute break until 6:20. Mr. Skelton, I will let you finish your point, and then we will discuss where we go next.
Thank you. Mr. Chambers, a last and brief issue from me, and it's a topic which I think Mr. Baker, who also represents a group of families, will pick up with you. But essentially it's this. It's a last opportunity, from my perspective, to give you the chance to speak with empathy.
Yes.
And speak with insight about the events of 2016 and 2017. By July 2016, you had the position that you had a group of neonatal consultants who suspected that their nurse, Lucy Letby, had murdered the babies on the unit. And we know that from all the evidence we have received and that came to the attention, that suspicion or concern came to the attention of the executives by 2016, certainly around the summer. You have at that stage an enormous asymmetry of knowledge or suspicion. The families are grieving still, but they have no idea that the pediatricians suspect they are grieving because their children have been murdered. And you have the hospital and the executives who are thinking and looking into that issue. You must understand from their perspective, they needed to be told of those concerns, and they needed to be told what investigations were being conducted by the hospital. Do you accept that?
Absolutely.
And that included the Royal College Review, which involved many of their children, Jane Horden's review, which involved many of their children, and Dr. McPartland. They needed to have been engaged in all of those processes. Do you accept that?
I absolutely accept that.
And one of the reasons, not simply a moral reason, is that they could have added in their input both factually, but also they could have said to you and the executives, these investigations are not good enough. You need to call the police. Because that is their prerogative, isn't it? If they think their children have been murdered, they have every right to say to you. The only organization possible to investigate these activities is the police. Do you understand that and accept it?
I accept that.
Lastly, on the coroner. I appreciate these are questions which I will have to put to Mr. Harvey when he gives evidence, but the coroner held an inquest into baby A's death on October 10th, 2016. At that inquest, Dr. Saladi and Dr. Jayaram gave evidence, and neither of them indicated that they suspected Lucy Letby had murdered child A. The hospital was represented by Lewis Brown, who was just about to become a KC, so he was very senior counsel. He didn't indicate that, and he will explain whether or not he knew or not about the concerns that were going on at that time. But it does appear that by hook or by crook, the coroner was not informed that there were suspicions about that child's death. That was unacceptable, wasn't it?
It clearly, in hindsight, is absolutely unacceptable. The context that we found ourselves in at the time, these matters weren't clear. I am not aware that what the KC Lewis Brown had been told. I am not part of any of these coronial processes. But what I am absolutely sure about is that there would have been no deliberate not sharing openly and honestly with the coroner the concerns. I don't know why Dr. Saladi and Dr. Jayaram didn't share those matters with the coroner through that inquiry, through that inquest, but I'm absolutely certain it wouldn't have been any sort of an instruction from the Countess, the hospital trust. And I think in their evidence, the doctor's evidence, they don't suggest that. But it does feel to me that maybe that was something that should have been shared, and I can't explain why it wasn't.
You had no personal involvement in the inquest process?
No.
The coroner, Mr. Reinberg, and his then deputy, and then became senior coroner, Mr. Moore, are clear that they were never told about the suspicions in respect of Lucy Letby during this period of time, 2016. So far as you were aware, is that correct?
In 2016, that's possibly the case. I can't confirm one way or another. I am sure that in 2017 the coroner were made aware of the concerns that the doctors had raised. I honestly can't tell you what the coroner was told in 2016 or... Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Skelton. So it seems to me we might be better doing this tomorrow morning. Everyone is nodding. I imagine that's... Sorry, if I can just speak to you, Mr. Chambers. I had considered an early start tomorrow morning, but I think that would not be convenient for those who are coming some distance. So I hope that it will be convenient for you. You haven't really got much choice about it.
No. I am happy to support.
To come at 10 o'clock tomorrow morning.
Sorry, say again?
10 o'clock tomorrow morning. May I make one thing crystal clear in case it hasn't previously been made clear, that there should be no communication between you and your lawyers, or indeed anybody else about the evidence that you are giving to this inquiry.
Thank you.
We will start again tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock. Thank you all for the long day.